Thank you all for joining us this morning for our Rural Digital Opportunity Fund webinar. My name is Stephen Ortega, and I'm the Grants Coordinator for the New Mexico Congressional Delegation. Today's webinar is going to be an opportunity for interested parties in New Mexico to hear about the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund and its potential to close the digital divide in New Mexico and bring service to currently unserved areas throughout our state. Joining us today will be Senator Tom Udall, who is going to be providing an overview of broadband deployment in New Mexico, as well as an update on recent federal broadband legislation. Today's presenters are going to include Jonathan McCormick. He's with the FCC and is the Deputy Director of their Rural Broadband Auction Task Force. John's going to be providing an overview of the RDOF auction and its relevant application procedures. After John, we're going to be hearing from Gar Clark, who is the Broadband Program Manager for the New Mexico Department of Information Technology. He's going to be sharing an update on the state's broadband mapping initiative, which may be helpful to prospective RDOF applicants. I will say at the outset that today's webinar is being recorded, so if at any point you need to step away, we will be able to make today's webinar available to any who would like to review at a later date in case they may have missed something. As stated, we intend for this webinar to be the first step in a broader conversation about engaging with the multi-billion-dollar RDOF auction and other federal broadband programs. So to that end, we will be taking question and answer. We'll be having a Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. So as you watch today, if you have any questions, feel free to share them in the chat for the presenters, or John will be providing an email to contact the FCC with questions directly at the top of his presentation. So please feel free to send questions to that, and we'll be able to answer any that come in or get you an answer from the relevant parties at the Federal Communications Commission. So with that, we'll be kicking things off today with remarks from Senator Udall. Senator, are you on the line? Okay, let's see.
Hello.
We can hear you, Senator. Go ahead.
Oh, okay, great. I just thank you, and hey, it's great to be with everyone today, and thank you for joining this important discussion. And thank you, Jonathan McCormick from the FCC and Gar Clark from the State of New Mexico's Department of Information Technology for helping guide us through the details of the Rural Digital Opportunities Fund auction. We all want to see New Mexico maximize this $6 billion opportunity to help bridge the digital divide in rural and low-income areas in our state. I don't need to tell all of you that we lag far behind in broadband access. For this auction alone, New Mexico has over 67,000 census blocks that are potentially eligible. That's nearly 40% of the state's blocks, areas that don't have fast enough broadband. We've got counties like Udall and Socorro with less than 10% coverage, Colfax and Catron that have less than 15% coverage. In a state with a population of about 2 million, we have over 340,000 residents who don't have the broadband access they need and deserve. And New Mexico tribes are behind too. Tribal areas around the nation have far less access to broadband than the rest of America. The FCC estimates 35% lack adequate broadband compared to 8% nationally. All of this is completely unacceptable. And this pandemic has done nothing but bring into stark relief the absolute imperative of universal broadband for workers to go to work, students to be in school, families to access health care, and small businesses to reach consumers. There's no getting around it. It is impossible to fully participate in today's society and economy without adequate broadband. But too many New Mexico families find themselves in that position. And that's why we're here today, to help New Mexico close the gap and level the playing field for rural, tribal, and hard-to-serve areas. I'm glad that Congress's COVID relief packages have included some broadband measures. In March, we passed the Broadband Data Act, which will finally improve the accuracy of FCC broadband maps. Without accurate data and maps, we can't effectively solve the problem. And last month, New Mexico was awarded $23 million in rural broadband grants as part of increased funding under the CARES Act to the Reconnect pilot program. More than 2,200 households in Acoma Pueblo and eastern New Mexico will get connected as a result. And while the upcoming auction represents a great opportunity, I must be candid that I'm disappointed this opportunity is not being made available to communities that have Reconnect funding or have state broadband development or subsidy programs. Along with about 24 Republican and Democratic senators, I wrote the FCC chair in March objecting to these restrictions that could de-incentivize communities from taking action to increase access. The fact is, bridging the digital divide is not red or blue, and as a member of the Senate Commerce Committee, I've been pushing Congress to do more for years. I'm pushing now for legislation that will make sure every K through 12 student has broadband access during this pandemic. As Vice Chair of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, I'm fighting for legislation that benefits tribal communities so that they are not shut out of the digital economy. In the 21st century demands universal access to broadband, and I'm going to keep working to make sure that's a reality for every New Mexican. Before I close today, I'd like to let you know that on July 8th, I will be co-hosting a webinar with Cabinet Secretary John Salazar and the Department of Information, the New Mexico Department of Information Technology, on other new federal broadband funding opportunities. My staff will be sending around information to you on that, and you can contact them for details as well. Thank you all again for attending today, and I'm sure that John and Gar have a lot of helpful information for you as we all continue to work together to connect New Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And now we'll be turning it over to John McCormick with the FCC for his presentation.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks to the Senator for helping kick this off. Just want to make sure you all can see my slides now. Just before we get started, I wanted to sort of echo some of what the Senator was talking about, where these programs are designed to really try to help bridge the digital divide and get funding to places that have for a long time been left behind. The pandemic that we've been in this year has really hit home in stark relief what the vital importance of that. Sometimes the work that at least I've done at the Commission can seem a little bit detached from the real world on the ground stuff, but nothing has made it clearer just how important this is to so many people and so many communities. In particular, tribal areas and New Mexico obviously faces a lot of these issues with the digital divide. I hope today can be a good opportunity to help get up to speed on what is coming up. and help people avail themselves of this opportunity to participate in the RDOF Phase 1 auction, which is coming up later this year. I also did want to just emphasize that there are some upcoming deadlines for this that are coming up pretty soon, which we'll go through in later detail. But if you are only just now kind of getting up to speed on the auction in general, I strongly encourage you to take advantage of the educational materials and resources that we've put on our website, including tutorials and other walkthroughs on how to participate and how to sign up and apply to partake in this auction. We'll go through that in more detail, but if you run into any questions during the webinar, you can email us at ruralbroadband@fcc.gov. You can also take advantage of the chat function in the WebEx if you've got questions, but I would encourage you, if you can, to send the questions to the email address. It helps us keep track of these, and if there's particular questions that we don't get to, maybe it's a very fact-specific question that we need to follow up with, or it's something that I frankly need some additional expertise in order to be able to answer. If you email the question in, it'll help us to keep track of that and reach back out and answer questions that we may not get to during the Q&A. So as I was mentioning, over the last couple of years, the Commission has taken a number of steps to help close the digital divide, mainly by awarding support for high-cost areas via auction. This includes the Connect America Fund Phase 2 auction, which awarded almost $1.5 billion over 10 years in Auction 903. This is now being followed by the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, which is what we're really going to be focused on today. And the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund Phase 1 will award up to $16 billion in Auction 904. That's really primarily going to be the focus of this webinar. Bidding in that is scheduled to commence in October 29th of this year. And then Phase 2 is going to award the remainder of the $20.4 billion at a later date. Additionally, just for your information, we're not really going to be focused on it today. There's the 5G Fund for Rural America that was proposed by the Commission in April. This would award up to $9 billion in support for mobile services, so to support deployment of 5G service to rural America. I just mentioned that in general, we're not going to be focused on it today, but there is an open comment cycle and proceeding on those proposals. I think the comments were due yesterday, but the reply comments are due in July. So if mobile high-cost support is something that you are interested in or have feelings on how we should go about designing that auction, I would encourage you to take a look at that as well. So how did we get here? Well, in 2011, the Commission adopted the Universal Service Fund Transformation Order, which introduced the use of a cost model to identify high-cost areas, and it also introduced the use of competitive bidding or auctions to award that support. The Connect America cost model was developed in 2014. And this model estimates the cost of providing service, as well as the number of locations in census blocks nationwide. High-cost blocks were identified as those that had locations with estimated costs above a particular cost threshold. And in 2015, the Commission offered model-based support to price cap carriers to deploy service to high-cost locations in their study areas by 2020. The Rural Digital Opportunity Fund is largely built upon the framework of the successful CAF Phase 2 auction. So let's talk a little bit more about CAF Phase 2. The Commission used a reverse auction to award support to census blocks where carriers declined offers of model-based support. excluding areas where carriers reported voice and greater than 10 megabits per second down and 1 megabit per second upload broadband service. In that auction, providers bid for support to serve eligible locations in high-cost census blocks, and these were aggregated into census block groups for purposes of bidding. In that, there were 30,000 census block groups containing 210,000 blocks and about 975,000 locations. CAF Phase 2 had a total budget of $2.15 billion. The auction, CAF Phase 2, closed in August of 2018 with approximately $1.5 billion in support awarded to provide service to more than 700,000 locations across 45 states. The locations where support was awarded had a model calculated reserve price of $5 billion, so resulted in serious savings to the Universal Service Fund, while also getting service deployed to a lot of these areas. As of this month, $1.45 billion in support has been authorized to over 643,000 locations. So we're getting close to the end of awarding support in that auction. There's really just a couple of remaining areas left to be awarded. And we'll talk about later, but the funding gets awarded through this approval of a long form application after the auction. So the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund framework will award up to $20.4 billion over 10 years to serve locations that lack voice and at least 25.3 megabits per second fixed broadband service. The Rural Digital Opportunity Fund will use a two-phased approach to award the support, including Phase 1, which is the auction that we're talking about today, Auction 904, which will include blocks that entirely lack 25.3, and that's going to be $16 billion of the budget. Phase 2 will award partially served blocks and any blocks that remain unsold in Phase 1, and will use the remainder of the $20.4 billion budget. The Commission will use a multi-round reverse clock auction format, which we'll discuss a little bit later, to award support to deploy service. And this is similar to the format used for CAF Phase 2. So what areas are actually eligible for support in the RDOF auction? Well, generally speaking, all census blocks that lack voice and at least 25.3 megabits per second broadband will be eligible for support, except non-high cost blocks, that's blocks with model estimated costs of less than $40 per location, or for tribal areas or blocks that lack even 10.1, there's a lower threshold of estimated costs of lower than $30. It also excludes blocks that were awarded funding in CAF Phase 2. It also excludes blocks that are awarded funding through federal or state broadband subsidy programs, and blocks in certain rate of return service areas. In mid-March, the Commission released a public notice that announced the preliminary eligible areas, and also established a limited challenge process. Challenges in that were due in April, and actually we just released updated data based upon the adjudicated challenges, but I'll discuss that in a bit. So the limited challenge process provided an opportunity to challenge the list of preliminary eligible areas. That's to identify census blocks that have become served by voice and 25.3 broadband since the most recent Form 477 data were filed. Also, it gave folks an opportunity to identify areas that have been awarded funding by a federal or state broadband subsidy program to provide service of at least 25.3. And this helps ensure that limited funds are not used to overbuild areas that already have service. However, the intent is to exclude areas where 25.3 service either has or will be deployed, not to prevent bidders from accessing other funding sources, including from states. And I also want to clarify something, because the Senator mentioned the Reconnect awards. There was a question at some point of whether areas that received 100% loans from Reconnect would be ineligible, and that is not the case. Those areas are going to be eligible, and those are reflected in updated data that was just released. The challenge process gave providers an opportunity to identify areas within rate of return service areas where the carrier does not expect to extend broadband as part of its USF obligations. And as I mentioned, the results of the limited challenge process and actually an updated list of eligible areas were released on June 25th, so yesterday. This shows a map of the eligible areas as reflected with the new updates that were released yesterday, as well as a URL to access that map. As you can see, there's a number of areas in New Mexico that are eligible. You can also get to this map from the Auction 904 webpage, which we'll have splashed on a bunch of other slides later in the presentation. But if you want to go directly to that to take a look at the areas that are eligible, I encourage you to go and take a look at that map. You can enter in a street address or a particular location and zoom down to see what areas are eligible. Additionally, the updated eligible areas can also be downloaded in tabular CSV format, as well as GIS data format if you're a technical person, from the Auction 904 website, which is located on the slide. It's fcc.gov/auction/904. These data files include information about the number of eligible locations for each census block, and the location counts that are on here reflect the results of the limited challenge process. So these were just updated yesterday, which we announced in a public notice that was released. As discussed, those updates reflect deployment updates from Form 477 filers, areas that were identified as receiving federal or state subsidies, and some updates from rate of return carriers. Here you can see that New Mexico has almost 65,000 eligible locations, which you can zoom into the map to see a little bit in closer detail about where those are or which census blocks those fall into. You can download some more information at the website. I did want to mention in particular about some information for tribal areas. The Commission has long recognized that there's really particular difficulties in deploying broadband to tribal areas. And based upon the updated eligible area data that we released, there are more than 235,000 eligible locations in tribal areas. And as mentioned before, briefly, the Commission adopted a 25% tribal broadband factor, which has the result of increasing the reserve price in all tribal areas by $10 per location. This also is reflected in a higher support cap for tribal areas. So there's no bidding credits in particular, but there's a preference for any areas that fall into tribal areas that folks can avail themselves to for deployment in tribal areas. So just sort of a bit of timing, the Commission adopted the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund framework in January and the proposed procedures for the Phase 1 auction in February. On June 9th, the Commission then adopted the Auction 904 procedures at its June Open Commission meeting. And per those procedures, we released on the 15th a tutorial on how to apply and how to submit a short form application for the Auction 904 application process. Additionally, we just updated the eligible areas. And so next up is the window to file these short form applications to participate. And this will be open on noon on July 1st, so coming up in a little less than a week. And will be open until 6 p.m. Eastern Time on July 15th. I'll go through this in a little bit more detail, what's actually required for this, but I do want to emphasize that we do not accept late filings. So if you are at all interested in participating, given that this is upcoming, I strongly encourage you to review the slides, to review the recordings, and look at the website for all of the information so that you can understand exactly what's going to be required if you want to participate so that you can get an application in during that time. again, there will be also contact information for everyone to understand how to reach out to the FCC and everyone else that's involved in this process to help walk you through that if you have questions. So after the applications are reviewed and qualified bidders are determined, we will release by October 14th a tutorial on bidding in auction 904. This will be followed by a mock auction on October 26th. And then bidding in auction 904 will actually commence on October 29th. After the bidding concludes, we will announce the close of the auction, followed by the window to file long-form applications for winning bidders. And once the long-form applications are reviewed, folks become authorized, and funding will actually proceed to folks that are authorized to receive the support. Similar to CAF Phase 2, we will use a single nationwide multi-round reverse auction. This design uses competition within and across geographic areas to identify the areas that are eligible, the areas that will receive money, and to determine the support amounts. Bidders will bid by committing to provide broadband service at a specified percentage of an area's reserve price. Since I've gotten a couple of questions about this, I wanted to also clarify the reserve price for an area. You can find out from looking at the files, the tabular files that are available on the Commission's Auction 904 webpage. But basically, it's the model-derived per location estimated cost minus a funding threshold up to a certain cap. So for most areas, because the cost threshold is $40, it's whatever the model estimated cost is minus $40 up to a max of $212. For tribal areas and those areas that lack even 10-1, it's actually a lower threshold. It's at $30. So it's actually the model cost minus $30 up to a higher cap of $222. But again, you can take a look at the data files that are on the Commission's webpage to understand precisely what the reserve price is going to be for each census block in the auction. Clock prices will start out higher than the budget and decrease in each round. To determine the implied support amount, the bid percentage is adjusted for service levels that have different performance tier and latency weights. I'll go through what those actually mean, but basically bidders that are bidding at a particular service level are committing to provide service that meets or exceeds the particular performance level, that's speed and data allowance, as well as the latency for which they're bidding. So as discussed, the performance and latency tiers and their associated bid weights for auction 904 are shown here. As mentioned, these tier and latency weights reduce the percentage of the reserve price that a bidder can receive and reflect a preference for higher speeds, and lower latency services. So for example, a bidder that's bidding at the low latency gigabit tier, for example, a fiber provider, would have a performance tier weight of 0 and a latency weight of 0 for a total bid weight of 0. This bidder would therefore have its clock price reduced by 0%. In other words, it would be offered the full clock price in each round. A bidder that is bidding at the high latency minimum tier, conversely, would have a performance tier weight of 50 and a latency weight of 40 for a total bid weight of 90. This bidder would therefore have its clock price reduced by 90%. In other words, it would be offered only 10% of the clock price in each round. Bidders that win support must deploy and offer service meeting or exceeding the performance levels for which they bid. So once the aggregate bids for support decrease to less than or equal to $16 billion, the auction will clear. In the round that the auction clears, support will be awarded in an area to the bidder that has the lowest tier and latency weight. This is a bit of a change from CAF Phase 2, so if you participated in that, you may want to pay attention to this. Bidding will continue in an area, however, if there are multiple bids with the same lowest T plus L weight. So really what that means, if there's two people bidding with a tier and latency weight of 0, maybe a gigabit fiber provider, and another gigabit fiber provider, at the clearing round, those people will continue bidding until one of them says, you know what, I'm not willing to do it for the price that's being offered. However, if there's one person who's bidding at a higher tier and one person bidding at a lower tier, at the clearing round, the support will be awarded to the provider that's bidding at that lower latency and tier and performance tier weight. The auction will then close once the budget clears and there's no more competing bids. Winning bidders must deploy service to the number of locations in which they won support and meet certain service milestones. Recipients must offer voice and broadband service to at least 40% of all locations within year 3, or by the end of year 3. These obligations increase 20% each year, with a requirement that 100% of model estimated locations must be served by year 6. There's also an optional year 2 milestone of 20%, which gives you a lower letter of credit requirement. And additionally, by year 8, the end of year 8, you actually have to provide service or deploy service to 100% of the actual locations. This will be factoring in additional improved mapping that the Commission is undertaking through its digital opportunity data collection, and will actually identify the precise locations, not just an estimated number of locations in a block. Recipients also have mandatory deployment reporting requirements that they have to file with the Universal Service Administrative Company. And also, the rates that are charged must be reasonably comparable to similar services in urban areas. So if you are familiar with CAF Phase 2, Auction 904 should be similar, but I'll just go through some of the differences for folks. Generally, the auction application process, the two-step short-form, long-form application process is the same. However, the per-location funding threshold for identifying high-cost blocks is lower. In CAF Phase 2, it was $52. Here it's $40. As well as we've got the tribal broadband factor preference, and then for areas that are lacking 10.1, you have that lower funding threshold of $30. Also, there's a per location funding support cap that's higher. In CAF Phase 2 is $146. Here it's $212, or for tribal areas and those lacking 10.1, it's $222. And then also at the clearing round, as I mentioned, support will be awarded to the bidder that has the lowest tier and latency weight. So probably the more important stuff, if you've made it this far and you're interested in participating in the auction, given that we've got a lot of upcoming deadlines, including the short form application filing window, is how to actually go about participating. So while the short form application window will open later this summer, it's scheduled to be open for 2 weeks from July 1st to July 15th. It's important that you start preparing to apply now. The process to apply to participate will be similar to parties that have participated in the CAF Phase 2 auction. Auction 904 specific resources, including the application tutorial, have now been made available on the Auction 904 website at the URL on the slide. Specifically, we also have a link to the education materials as well. And parties that are interested in participating can also look at materials that are still available about folks who apply, for folks who were applying in Auction 903. So if you want to understand a little bit more about that or take a look at the applications that came in for Auction 903, you can access those at the Auction 903 webpage, also listed on this slide. So anybody who wants to participate in Auction 904 must submit a short form application by the deadline. Late submissions will not be accepted, and I'm sorry to report the auctions division is very, very strict about that. So please, please, please keep in mind that the deadline to file a short form application is July 15th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Parties that file a short form application are not obligated to bid in the auction, however. So if you are still on the fence about actually participating or actually bidding, I encourage you to at least consider putting an application in if you're otherwise interested, because it at least gives you the opportunity to participate later on if that's what you decide to do, but you're not obligated to actually do so. To complete their application, parties will need to submit financial, technical, and other ownership information, as well as information detailing the previous provision of telecommunications service, if that's applicable. And we'll go through specifically some of those requirements in the following slides. So applicants must establish the required operational history and financial information necessary to participate. This can be done in one of two ways. So sort of the first main way is for applicants that have provided voice, broadband, and or electrical distribution or transmission service for at least 2 years. These guys may establish their eligibility to participate, but must certify and demonstrate that they have actually provided such service for 2 or more years. If an applicant has provided voice or broadband service for at least 2 years, it needs to certify filing its FCC Form 477 data for the relevant time period. If an applicant has provided only electrical distribution or transmission service for at least 2 years, there's a requirement to submit qualified operating or financial reports that demonstrate at least 2 years of operational history. These specific requirements also are detailed in the Auction 904 procedures public notice, which I will link to later on, but it's also available on the Auction 904 webpage, and this all is covered in the application tutorial as well. Under this pathway for eligibility, applicants must provide 1 year of audited financial statements. However, at the short form stage, unaudited financials may be accepted if the applicant is not otherwise audited in the normal course of business. During the long form application, there is a need to see audited financials at that point, but at the short form stage, if you aren't normally audited in the normal course of business, you may not have to do it here. Alternatively, applicants that have not been operating for at least 2 years may still participate. So Auction 904 is not closed to new entrants. However, such applicants must submit 3 years of audited financial statements, as well as a letter of interest from a qualified bank. Applicants must also submit technical information. This includes each state, performance tier, and latency for which the applicant wants to bid, as well as the technology that it would use to provide service at that tier and latency. If an applicant is intending to use wireless technology, it must submit information on the spectrum to which the applicant has access and would be using to meet those requirements. Also, applicants will be required to answer technical questions that are included in Appendix A of the Auction 904 Procedures Public Notice. Applicants must also submit ownership information. This includes the name and its legal classification, as well as the individuals who would be authorized to communicate with Commission staff and to place bids. It would also requiring the disclosure of all parties, including non-applicants with whom the applicant has entered into any agreements regarding its participation in the auction. And additionally, an applicant must disclose all individuals and entities that have an ownership interest in the applicant, whether it's a direct ownership interest or an indirect ownership interest, as well as all FCC-regulated businesses in which the applicant itself has a direct interest. So applicants will also be required to provide additional information, and this includes the list of the applicant's study area codes, if the applicant is already an eligible telecommunications carrier, the list of the FRNs that it uses to file FCC Form 477 during the past 2 years, if that's applicable. This can also apply to holding companies and other affiliated entities that may be associated with the applicant that have filed filed FCC Form 477 data before. The filer ID also used by the applicant to file FCC Form 499A in the past year, if that's applicable, as well as other required certifications. Additional requirements and specifications are detailed in the Auction 904 Procedures Public Notice. There's a direct link to the PDF version of that document on this slide, but don't worry about taking that down. If you don't want to, you can get to the Auction 904 Procedures Public Notice, as well as all other material on the Auction 904 webpage, which, as I mentioned before, that's fcc.gov/auction/904. So a couple additional things just to note. So parties may form a consortium that is made up of multiple parties that participate in the auction as a single bidder. For the short form application process, a consortium must choose a single lead entity to certify how long it's been operating and to submit its financial statements. All other information must be submitted for each member of the consortium alongside a roadmap explaining how that information pertains to each of the different providers. A consortium bids in the auction as a single entity and may then, after the auction, divide winning bids among its members after the conclusion of the auction. Given the sort of complexities of consortiums and the questions that arise about that, if you have any specific questions regarding consortia, you can please email either Rural Broadband or auction904@fcc.gov. And again, I'll have those email addresses later on in the slide deck. But that is something, if you have a question about that, I can answer generally, but I really need to get some of the experts on to dive into some of the questions there. Additionally, just to note, all auction participants must follow the Commission's rules on prohibited communications. So generally, an auction applicant is prohibited from communicating with any other applicant in any manner, the substance of its own, one another's, or any competing applicants' bids or bidding strategies. And this applies to applicants beginning with the short form application deadline, July 15th, whether they ultimately qualify or bid or not. Applicant also includes the entity controlling the application, the applicant includes the entity submitting the application, also any party with control in the entity, any party that is controlled by the applicant, or controlled by a party controlling the applicant entity. So please, 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 I can't emphasize this enough, please take care of communications to third parties. Third parties may be conduits for the disclosure of information that would violate the prohibited communications rules. If you have specific questions related to the prohibited communications, please email auction904@fcc.gov. That we can, again, get some of the experts on to answer some of those specific questions that I may not be able to answer today. So additionally, there's some other resources you can go to, as I've mentioned several times, the Auction 904 webpage. That's fcc.gov/auction/904. If you have questions specifically about Auction 904, including prohibited communications, information about the short form application, or things about forming a consortium, you can email those directly to auction904@fcc.gov, and that'll go to a larger team that's working on the auction so that they can respond to that. You can also email me and others on the Rural Broadband Auctions Task Force, and we also have a web page there. Our email address is ruralbroadband@fcc.gov. If you have questions that you want answered in the webinar, you should probably direct them to that ruralbroadband@fcc.gov. For anybody who's on and represents a municipal government or state government or anything like that, you can contact Greg Cook. He's the chief of the Intergovernmental Affairs Office. Or for tribal issues, we generally try to engage with our colleagues in ONAP, the Office of Native Affairs and Policy, and Matthew Duchesne's email address is up there as well. So if you have specific questions about those, you can always email Auction 904 or Rural Broadband, and we can redirect you. But you can also reach out directly to those folks. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gar to talk about some of the specifics in New Mexico, including the broadband efforts. And Gar, take it away.
Okay, well, thank you, John. That was absolutely amazing. And for a simple geographer, you really put forth a lot of information that was understandable. And thank you, Senator Udall and his fabulous staff for putting this together for the state of New Mexico. I'm just going to very quickly give you an overview of our mapping, which many of you are familiar with, but we've added some improvements that could help you in the application of RDOF, but also Reconnect and other grants that might be available. So this first slide really shows some of the basics that we keep on improving upon. One new factor, which some of you have contributed to, the ISPs and the state library, schools, and whatnot, is a public Wi-Fi parking lot hotspots layer that as you can see there on the image, it shows where it is and maybe some restrictions or hours. It may show password protection and what password is needed. But also, too, it emphasizes, the practice social distancing, as well as to fill out your census form. And if it's on tribal land, that there is restricted to tribal members only. So we also have availability by technology type. Thank you very much for all the providers who have provided data directly to us, which is more granular. For those who did not want to participate, we pulled down the FCC 477 data. And for that matter, too, when it comes to mobile wireless, we've done some analysis, analytics lately to assist the schools in properly placing their hotspots into residential homes for families and students by an address point, which comes out of the New Mexico 911 program, which also reveals or informs what mobile wireless providers provide services at that address and what type of mobile service that we have. So we've put that out and provided it all to the school districts so that they can have a better chance of properly placing hotspots and providing that service to the schools. So, but also too, that has been good. Fiber cable, DSL fixed. I have some imagery there that shows that. We also have CASA, which is public facilities, community anchored site assessments. We're constantly updating that. Schools, libraries, health, law enforcement are there. So those are your big users. And we've been doing a constant update of that to make sure that we have all of those types of data associated with it. We're dipping down from state into local community anchored institutions as well. So that's part of the project. Structures, address points, as I mentioned, New Mexico 911, they're updated monthly. Do that because of that program, and those data have been very important in, as I said, identifying hotspots and also who has service versus who does not have service. Telecom resources, we've got all the towers that we are able to flush out, normalize, about 12,000 of them, 10,000 I think. Those are also on our website, and then county and tribal boundaries. So there's a bunch of information there that is useful to you. Address points for maybe calculating take rates, things of that sort. So, John, next slide, please. Now, these are the recent additions that can be, I think, very helpful to the ISPs in their application. And one of them is that we've mapped all the awarded areas, Connect America funds and USDA Reconnect funds. The CAF2 is there, the original from the CAM, the CAF are all mapped there for you. You can see that too on the image on the left side. We also have, and we're going to update it too with the new update that was on June 20th, the RDOF Auction 904 eligible areas. And So, but we have those mapped as well, if you see that in the lower right. And then we also have mapped the challenged areas with 5 providers in New Mexico who have challenged certain areas within the state. Frontier being, of course, the big one in the news. And that's something too, John, that we need to understand a little bit more of what's going to happen with all of those. So also to be helpful to you, we mapped also underneath administrative boundaries, we've got economic opportunity zones. And those in some of the grants and the loans and that are being offered, if you are in one of those areas, you get additional points. So, so anyhow, we have those for you so that you can compare those also with rural places. And we have those mapped also too, 20,000 and below rural places within the state of New Mexico. So all of this mashed together can be helpful to you, these data. I know some of you have your own mapping facilities, and we can, you know, our effort at the Department of Information Technology and the Offices of Broadband and Geospatial Technologies is to support you all as much as possible in order to get broadband capacity expanded and into the state of New Mexico. So if we can help you with data, give us a call or email me, and we'll make that happen. Now, just recently released too, if you see down there on the bottom left, is our New Mexico Broadband Strategic Plan and Rural Broadband Assessment. So this is an update of our 2014 Broadband Strategic Plan, which of course in some of the grants, like the Reconnect, provides additional points for your application. That state does have a broadband program, which we do, and the state also has a strategic plan, which we've just updated just in the last week or so. So have a look at that. That may be helpful too. There's a lot of great data in there and some costs associated with it and areas that we need to look at and prioritize. So thank you very much. That's all I have.
Thanks. So we're going to I'll take a little bit of a break to see what questions may have come in to the rural broadband email address, as well as questions that may have come up in the chat, and we can try to address some of those there. In the meantime, or if you don't want to stick around for the Q&A, thanks for having this, participating in this webinar. I'm grateful for the opportunity that Senator Udall's office has put together to get the word out about this auction. I know some of this stuff can seem a bit daunting, or you might be not sure exactly how to avail yourselves of these resources and opportunities, but we are really trying to drum up as much participation and interest in this auction as possible, so that we can really try to do make this money stretch as far as possible to help close the digital divide. And I know in particular, in New Mexico and some of the tribal areas, there's a lot of remote rural areas that are definitely in need of good quality broadband, especially as we've seen given the impact of the pandemic. So I strongly encourage anybody who's made it to this point to go to the website, take a look at the different materials and different resources that are available there to participate in, go through the tutorial on how to apply. If you are serious about this, you may want to try to, dedicate a person to fully understand what's going to be required of you before the application window opens. But if you have questions, you can email to me, you can email Rural Broadband, you can email the Auction 904 team on the email address in the slide, as well as you can reach out to Gar or Steve directly, so that they can help direct and answer your questions. But there are a lot of resources available to you, so don't feel shy. If you have a question, even if it seems simple, please email us. We are trying to be as diligent as possible about getting back to people in a short time period, and we are willing and happy to help folks as they try to navigate this process to participate. So With that, I'm going to take I'll go on mute and take a brief break and see what other questions have come in. Although actually before I do that, since Gar had mentioned it, there were some challenges that were in the state of New Mexico. Gar's office and others may not have had a chance to fully digest what the results of the challenge process were. I can tell you that the challenge submitted by Frontier was generally speaking denied in terms of where there were updates to their Form 477 deployments. There have been other things submitted in the record that seemed to call that into question, and staff made a determination that they hadn't established that they actually had provided these services, and moreover had submitted something that seemed to withdraw their application or their challenge. We did accept some challenges from Frontier where they were asserting that they were the recipient of a subsidy. I think that only impacted maybe the state of New York, and other areas were not taken. So you can take a look at that public notice. It's available on the Commission's website on that Auction 904 page. And you can also look at the updated map to see which areas are available. But just because an area was challenged doesn't necessarily mean that we accepted the challenge. You can take a look and go through that. But I can talk more about that if people have specific questions. But I would otherwise encourage you to take a look at the materials that we've released. So I'm going to go on mute now for a minute, and I'll come back to answer some of the questions that have come in.
Thanks for that, John and Gar. Those were very informative presentations. And just to reiterate what John has said, we are here to help with every aspect of the RDOF auction process. If you have further questions or you need assistance from the congressional side, please do reach out and email me. No question is a bad question. We're happy to help as best we can. I see now that some people are posting in the chat too, and please go ahead, continue to do that in this little lull we're in now. John will be back to answer questions shortly.
All right, thanks, Steve. So it looks like I'm not seeing a lot of questions or any questions that came in through the rural broadband email address. So I will just kind of go through some of the questions that I got specifically. Somebody was asking if I'm using my webcam or can I use my webcam. I'm not fully dressed up for business attire, so I probably am not going to do that. But somebody also was asking about if the areas on the map that we had on an earlier slide are the areas in blue are eligible. So I'll go back to that slide. Yeah, so the map that shows the eligible locations, you can see it if you actually go to this web page and pull it up. You can actually view a few different layers. But the blue areas are, I believe, the census blocks that have eligible locations within them. So these will be grouped in the auction into census block groups, but the areas in blue are areas that have eligible locations located within them. And I know that some people have asked in other outreach events that we've done if they can find out like where the actual locations are within a census block. And unfortunately, no, not really. The model has estimated the addresses, using address location and population counts from the Census Bureau. It's estimated where the locations fall, though there's some proprietary location data involved in that, and I don't know that's something we have the ability to release. Regardless, they're just estimates. They're not actually based upon real locations. It's obviously based upon a model. And so that's why the commission, which is undergoing, is undertaking this effort, sort of resulting from the Broadband Data Act, although its efforts preceded this, to improve its mapping of where the actual locations that are serviceable for broadband actually are within a census block. There have been a lot of questions about data accuracy and about understanding, why we rely upon census block level data. Unfortunately, it's basically the best sort of data that we have at this point. And the commission, though, is undertaking an effort sort of as a result of the legislation that was passed to improve its mapping and require submission of actual shapefile data, sort of polygons showing where the locations that are served by a particular provider actually are. And we are hopeful that we will have that information as well as something called a broadband serviceable location fabric, which will have addresses and locations for the whole country. We're hopeful that we'll have that in place in the upcoming couple of years. And at that point, we will be able to identify much more precisely where the locations are. And that's why for year 8 of your milestone build-outs, there's a requirement for winning bidders to deploy to all of the actual locations and not just the model locations. We don't have much better information at the moment than the model-based locations, but we will have that. We're hopeful and optimistic that we will have all of that in the next couple of years as the Commission undertakes this really large mapping effort to improve its understanding of where locations actually are. Just to go through a couple more questions, somebody's asking.
Hello, John?
Yes.
John?
Yes.
If I may interject, this is Gar Clark again. And with regards to the mapping, until the Broadband Data Act is implemented, which is a breath of fresh air we've been looking at for 10 years plus to get more granular data, with the New Mexico broadband map, you can, similar to what you can do with the FCC map, is by address, go down, but you can also turn on the address points. So you know where the communities are within the eligible areas. So you know where the cluster of folks are. By the way, those data are updated monthly from the local governments. There must be there's over 85 different sources that we collect every month, process, and put into this statewide model. So that is one way to see where the folks are and also to calculate take rates. Now, note that these are address points, so they're a combination of residential, business, and it could be abandoned buildings, but at least gives you some basic numbers that you can look at as to where the folks are in relationship to some of the infrastructure that we have mapped as well. So, our map does have more granular information that can help make it a better decision. So thank you, John.
Thanks, Gar. That's very useful. Unfortunately, we don't have that for everything quite yet, but that's definitely very useful for folks in New Mexico, and I think will help people understand. The part of the thinking about the requirements for deploying to actual locations versus model-based locations, in addition to just not having necessarily all of the data available, is that folks who are on the ground in these communities or are local providers probably have a much better sense of where they've hooked up. If they're an electrical transmission company, they probably understand where they've actually hooked up houses and locations than the Commission does, at least at the moment. So hopefully they can take advantage of that. But certainly to the extent that there's information on the New Mexico map, I think that's a great resource to use. So somebody was asking a question of how many pages is the short form application. So it's a web page online form that you fill out. I'm not sure exactly how many pages. There's definitely like 10 or more screens that you have to go through, including a screen about the applicant information, agreements, ownership, a certification screen. So you can go take a look at the tutorial that's on the website or the technical guide that's on the Auction 904 webpage. It might give you a little bit of a better sense. I don't actually know off the top of my head how many pages it is. Additionally, somebody's asking, will we be sending out the slides? I don't actually have the participant list, but I certainly can send out this slide deck for folks if you want to see it. There's also, I think, a recording that Senator Udall's office was planning on making available. But yeah, we can certainly send something around if you want these slides. There's also a slightly older version of this webinar, which is largely the same, though it's at this point several weeks out of date. that's also available on that Auction 904 webpage, but we can certainly send around this sort of custom-tailored and updated version for folks who are interested.
Don, we can help get that slide share out too to our list.
So somebody was asking about urban connectivity deserts in the Albuquerque area. You'd have to go and take a look at areas on that map. If the locations are not estimated to have a high cost, they're generally not going to be included as eligible areas in the auction. If they are high cost, which presumably they may be because some folks haven't deployed there yet, if nobody's reporting service or nobody's reporting service of 25.3, then those areas would be eligible in the auction. So I strongly encourage folks who have questions and maybe even interested in deploying in places that don't have great connectivity in Albuquerque to go to the website and search for a particular address or search for a particular location on that map. And you can see specifically what areas are going to be eligible. If you have specific questions about that, you can also email us and we can help walk you through how to do that. Somebody's also asking about the slides, and we will send those around. But the other question that I see in the chat is, are there benefits to forming consortia? I mean, that sort of depends on the, I guess, particular providers' circumstances. I mean, yes, there are definitely some potential benefits if you want to pool resources so that you can have fewer people who have to man a computer to bid in the auction or to participate in those there. You can avail yourselves of some package bidding if you're bidding for larger collections of areas. And there may be also some folks that know that they don't expect to compete against another entity. They're only interested in providing service in a particular town, and there's another municipal entity or local electrical co-op in a neighboring town, and maybe they want to band together to submit and bid in the auction as a single entity. But it's really dependent upon the particular circumstances of individual providers. But if you have specific questions about that, you can certainly reach out to the staff at Auction 904 at fcc.gov, and we can help explain things or help walk you through what the pros and cons may be, or other considerations that you may need to keep in mind if you are interested in participating in the auction as part of a consortium. And with that, I don't see any other questions that I've seen come into the rural broadband email box. So, if people have questions now, we can address them, or we can otherwise wrap things up. One more question. Can you expand on the areas that were excluded because the provider indicated it will not serve? So for rate of return carriers in certain service areas, they may have accepted ACAM support or sort of other model-based support, and they have obligations to deploy to certain areas within their service area to meet all of the high-cost locations in order to fulfill their obligations. We otherwise generally excluded any areas that were where they had accepted model-based support for these rate of return areas. But the challenge process allowed for such rate of return providers to indicate that they weren't going to meet their deployment obligations in certain areas. I can tell you that nobody actually filed such a challenge. So we did get some challenges that were submitted by rate of return carriers who had questions or concerns about how we had drawn the or determine the eligible areas for blocks that are adjacent or partially overlapping with their service areas. Generally speaking, there are census blocks in this auction that are partially eligible because they overlap in part, like a service area for a rate of return carrier. So some of the locations maybe fell outside of the eligibility and aren't eligible, but the others were eligible. So we had some concerns or challenges that were submitted that were a bit outside the scope of the challenge process from these rate of return carriers, and those were not accepted in the auction. We have a separate process to make sure that their study area boundaries are correct, but we verified that the processing that we did was accurate for all of those locations. So in most cases, it was due to a partial overlap with a rate of return study area. Okay, well, if that answered the last question and nobody else has questions, I guess maybe I'll open it up to the floor. Steve, I don't know if you or Gar, if you guys want to chime in with anything, but I'm not seeing any other questions at this time.
Is there any other questions that people have that they haven't had a chance to ask? Okay, if not, I think we'll move towards closing off the webinar here. Please remember that the emails posted here are accessible for you to ask any questions you might have in the future. So if you can't think of it right now, totally fine to get back in touch with us later. I want to flag that again, this webinar will be recorded and we'll be sending the webinar and the slides for your use next week. So keep an eye out for that. And lastly, I just want to make sure that you're aware that we will be hosting a future broadband webinar going over many more funding streams that can support the deployment of broadband in New Mexico. And as Senator Udall said, that's going to take place on July 8th at 9:30 a.m. Mountain Time. So keep an eye out for future details. We'll send out a registration for that event in the near future as well. And with that, thank you all for joining us today. And please feel free to reach out if there are any other questions.